So we will continue with this conference, and we are entering the final third panel, and we will have two final very interesting presentations. So the first one is by Federico Ottavio Reho from the Wilfried Martens Center, and his talk is called Conservatism, Christian Democracy and the Radical Right in Historical Perspective. A very interesting topic, because nowadays, at least in this community, we think a lot about the future of center-right and conservatism. So this topic is really very topical today. So it's the floor is yours, Federico.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to the Institute of European Right. We are delighted to have you as a partner, and now actually as a full member of the Martens Center. Of course, I mean, as you know, the Martens Center is a Brussels-based organization, the political foundation of the EPP, but it also has a continental network of foundations. So we walk on the legs of our national partners in the member states. And it is important to have a very strong Lithuanian leg. Yeah, I will focus in my talk on the third kind of topic of today's discussion on crisis, a possible crisis of European identity, and that is conservatism, Christian democracy, and the radical right in historical perspective. I will do it with an EPP touch. I mean, as I said, the Martens Center is the political foundation of the European People's Party. So I will try to develop some thoughts in three parts. The first part, I will try to briefly survey a little bit the landscape of the center-right and right-wing political spectrum in historical perspective. What is there on the center-right and the right? What are the different movements? How should we understand it? The second part, I will try to reflect a little bit on some historical junctures over the last 2 centuries or so, in which we saw a significant presence of what we could call radical right forces, and therefore a problem of how mainstream conservatives, establishment conservatives related to these radical right forces. And the third part, I will zoom in a little bit more attentively to the most recent such occurrence, which is, I think we are living through it. It's the last 10, 15 years. And so, I mean, some of the problems, the questions that we are asking ourselves also in the EPP is, how should we relate with these forces, and should we engage with them? To what extent should we engage with them? Should we differentiate different parts of the radical right, or should we take a posture of radical opposition and uncompromising, fight? So these are the three parts that I have in mind. I will start from, as I said, some basic political categories of the center-right and the right. They are probably known to you, but I think for conceptual clarity, it is good to start from basic definitions. And I will try to consider them as they arose historically, chronologically. So the first, I don't need to delve into the origins of these categories. You probably are aware about, the post-French Revolution background of most of them. And the sitting order, facing the French king, from which they arise, but this doesn't matter. The first to arise was conservatism. So first of all, what do we understand by it, and what are its internal branches? When I speak about conservatism, I always distinguish a kind of mainstream or moderate establishment wing of conservatism. You see it throughout history. But there has always been also a more reactionary stream of conservatism. And I think they are rather different in their posture and in their outlook. So the moderate establishment conservatism, I think, arose out of a reaction to the most radical features of the Enlightenment first, and then particularly of the French Revolution. And I think at its core there is a defense of limited politics and the philosophy of organic change against modern Enlightenment radicalism, the notion that change is always for the better, and that we must live in society that are perpetually on the move, perpetually looking towards some kind of imagined progress. And therefore, it's a philosophy that is skeptical in nature, that puts a prime on historical continuity, that denies what Enlightenment liberalism believed, that human nature is fundamentally malleable, and therefore that you can eliminate its flaws if only you act on it wisely enough, if only you educate it sufficiently. No, I mean, there is a belief that the human nature is not malleable, and it is fallen. So evil is a necessary feature of the world, and they cannot be eliminated by policy or political actions. So it's a philosophy that is very anti-utopian. If conservatism is a utopia, it does not belong to this world, because, of course, conservatism, most strands of modern conservatism in Europe add a Christian flavor to them, and therefore, if they had a utopia, it was a utopia beyond history. So that's how I understand conservatism. Reactionary conservatism, so if you want, it's a philosophy of organic change, or gradual evolution, of avoiding radical ruptures and of seeking historical continuity. Reactionary conservatism is very different. It is different since its inception. If you read the authors like Joseph de Maistre or de Bonald, you know, some of the French theoreticians of reaction and reactionary conservatism, there is a radical rejection of modernity. There is an awareness that the traditional order is broken, but there is a desire to reinstitute it through a kind of neo-traditional order, because once tradition is broken, its restoration can only be, it's not traditional anymore. It has to be brought about normally by violent means. And this is one of the interesting features, I think, of reactionary thought, that there is always this tension between spontaneity and statism. I mean, I think conservatism tends to be a philosophy ultimately of spontaneity, of spontaneous orders, if you want, of historically evolved institutions. But once these institutions are broken and threatened, and the reactionary thought wants to reinstitute them, they inevitably have to rely on state violence and state power to do that. And I mean, this may seem very abstract to you, but some of the contemporary reactionary movements look at Viktor Orban's Hungary, and look also to an extent at law and justice rule in Poland until some time ago. You see this element. There is a sense of cultural laws. There is a sense that some values that were previously maintained by intermediary bodies, for example, are gone, because the intermediary bodies are gone in very individualized societies. And so you try to use the power of the state to reinstitute them using the violence of the state, which is already a basic loss of the spontaneity of a conservative order. So then the radical right, what do I mean by radical right? I would say that historically we have seen two manifestations of the radical right. One very historically contingent, although we keep speaking about it and we think we know it better, and that's fascism. I think very historically contingent, because I believe that most fascist regime died out with the Second World War or in the early post-war period. There were conservative authoritarian regimes that had fascistic elements, but I think it was a rather circumscribed historical experience, despite the fact that, as you know, everybody, I mean, it's a label that keeps being used, often inappropriately, to label, you know, new radical right movements, which in my opinion have nothing to do with fascism. I will therefore set it aside. I will just say very briefly that it's a completely specific historical phenomenology. It's a totalitarian political religion. I think it's essentially a religious phenomenon. I rely on this, on authors like Erich Vögeling, the German philosopher, but also Emilio Gentile, a prominent Italian historian, which pursues an immanentized eschaton, paradise on earth. It's a kind of post. It's an immanentization of the Christian vision of paradise as attainable on earth, and therefore there are some idolatric, dimensions that become, that offer the possibility of achieving salvation on earth. The state, the nation, the race, depending on the. I think that this I don't see any such form of radical right thought around us today. But there is another, less understood, less known, I think, form of the radical right, which has been present all along, and this is what in the interwar period was called revolutionary conservatism. The label revolutionary conservatism was developed in Germany in the interwar period and then consolidated in the early post-Second World War period in some analysis of this phenomenon. And these are forces that position themselves on the right. They are not fascist, although in some cases they were contiguous with fascist regimes. And what they seek is, they seek a form of radical organic unity that eliminates all conflicts, you know. They seek to go beyond all conflicts, and in this sense, I think that the contemporary version of this historically present phenomenon is populism, what we call populism, which, if you think about it, in its unitary conception of the people, it attempts to branch out, to eliminate, to crowd out all the internal articulations of the people, and in its rhetoric as the people versus the elite, as a very monolithic, unitary conception of the people. And there are some interesting features that are recurrent, I think, in all forms of revolutionary conservatism. There is a tendency to often present themselves as beyond left and right, both in their rhetoric and in their economic policies. Very often these political movements have embraces left-wing economic policies. That is the case. Look at today, I don't know, Rassemblement National, which is an essentially socialist economic policy. There is a kind of strange cathartic, a quest for a kind of cathartic overhaul of the existing institutions, which is, of course, as you can imagine, totally absent in mainstream conservatism. There is a reliance on strong leadership. I mean, this is where the heroic ethos of which you were speaking can go wrong, you know, when you push it to these extremes. There is a very pushed heroic ethos. And maybe the aspect that I find most interesting is the religious aspect, the religious posture of revolutionary conservatism, which swings either it is a form of neo-pagan vitalism. This was typical, for example, of the interwar revolutionary conservatism in Germany. They were very influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, and they rejected Christianity altogether, and they embraced some form of neo-pagan vitalism, often going back to pagan cults. And again, it may seem abstract to you, but think about canon in the US in the Trump movement, you know, the sectarian vision of canon. If you remember the assault on the Capitol and Jake Angeli dressed as a Viking, that's the aesthetic, it's quite unmistaken, that's the aesthetic of the revolutionary conservative vision, this apocalyptic, you know, search for either a neo-pagan salvation, or when it is Christian, it tends to be very a very kind of millenarian apocalyptic Christianity, not the kind of skeptical Catholic Christianity that, you know, mainstream conservatives tend to be comfortable with, but a quest for a radical regeneration. I go to Christian democracy very briefly, and then Christian democracy is a funny, I meant is the other political movement of the center-right historically. It is the latest comer, if you think about it, because it only exists in its current form since 1945. The roots are in the political Catholicism, of course, of the 19th century, but there is a fundamental change between political Catholicism and Christian democracy, and that's the fact that political Catholicism was head-on confrontation with modernity as a fundamental threat to the Christian political order. You may remember the syllables of error of Pius IX in 1870, which condemned everything modern, you know, from liberalism to nationalism to democracy. Well, I think after the Second World War, there is a shift, and the Christian democratic approach becomes a desire to contaminate modernity, to embrace modernity, to engage with modernity, but to change the trajectory of modernity in a direction that is not anti-Christian and that is fertilized by Christianity, and that within which a free church can play its role. And so at an ideological level, I think what is interesting about Christian democracy is that it very often works with synthetic concepts, third-way concepts. It sees itself as a movement of the center, and if you look at some of it, take the social market economy. It's neither the liberal economy nor the communist economy. It's a third-way idea of economic order. Take personalism as a kind of philosophy. It is not liberal individualism, it is not socialist collectivism, it is a vision of the person as embedded in a web of relationships that structure society, and therefore results then constitutionally in a vision that is based on subsidiarity, which is where you come in later on, and federalism. So these are, I think, the movements, as I understand them, of the center-right and the right. And so now I move to my second point, the second part, which is when have we faced, I think historically, having this constellation of forces in mind as a problem of relationship with a strong radical right, between the mainstream right and the strong radical right. And my impression is that there have been at least 3 instances over the last 2 centuries, so modern political history. The first instance, it seems to me, was actually in the early 19th century. I think that there are many elements of what we would later call revolutionary conservatism already in the Romantic movement, in Romantic nationalism, during, therefore, the period in which, the conservative powers were fighting against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. And actually, Romantic conservatism was fundamental to defeat, Napoleon, because it could tap on the new nationalist forces. They were the old establishment conservatives were unable to connect with the national masses. The Romantic conservatives could do that, and so they harnessed that energies against revolutionary France. But it was the traditional conservatives, the establishment conservatives, like the Metternichian conservatives, that were firmly in charge. There was no question about that. The 2 constituencies, so therefore, for a while were allied. They didn't like each other. Metternich hated Romanticism. I mean, you can trace that because he was an Enlightenment, skeptical conservatives. But they tapped on the forces of somehow these radical elements to defeat revolution, and that's the first, I think, instance where this happened. A second instance, I think, is the first decades of the 20th century, where you have a variety of movements that start rebelling. These are less known, I think, but there is a variety of, for example, of youth movements in a number of Western European countries, particularly Germany. So the young generations rebelling against the materialism of the bourgeois, epoch, and embracing forms of visions that were, on the one hand, very backward-looking historically, so they had a conservative dimension, but they were also very futuristic. Futurism, by the way, as an artistic and cultural movement in Italy, is another part of this manifestation of revolutionary conservative pattern. So this mixture of a backward-looking historical imagination with a very forward-looking, technologically driven vision, which again, you find again, Musk is a futurist, essentially, combining, wokist element and a kind of a transhumanist vision of a technologically driven, interplanetary humanity. And then, in this period you also have the proper people probably called new conservatives. I won't enter into this because probably it's too detailed, but people like Müller van den Broek in Germany or Julius Evola in Italy, probably you have never heard of them, but they were very influential thinkers in the interwar period. And the third moment, as I said, is the one that we are going through. And before I focus on this latest moment more recently, what do all these moments have in common historically? And if we want to generalize, if we want to take a kind of applied history approach to this, I think that what they have in common is that they are revolutionary conservatism tends to appear where in moments of significant economic, social, cultural dislocation, upheavals, disorientation. These were all moments in which politically, socially, economically, and culturally there was a deep sense of upheaval and crisis. I wouldn't insist too much on the specific aspects of it because I think I don't have time, but to give you a sense, of course, the first period that I have mentioned, you have the revolutionary wars, the crumbling of many established orders. In the early 20th century, you have a very pushed imperialist competition that is changing the shape of the world. In our time, I think we feel a great geopolitical uncertainty that is dictated by the return of history, what we call the return of history. You have economically the first industrial revolution, then you have the second industrial revolution in the second period that I have mentioned, and now we have the Great Recession and all the economic and the fiscal challenges that have followed it. You have in the first period a reaction against enlightened, the Enlightenment, somehow cosmopolitanism, and now then the Belle Epoque cosmopolitanism, and now globalization. So there are a lot of, I think, similar recurrent patterns that you see. And finally, at the cultural level, you have the general sense of loss of traditional, I think, Christian values, and the continuing decline of Europe's Christian civilization. I mean, first in the post-Enlightenment period, then in the early 20th century, and now in the recent decades. So I think this is what tends to characterize the movement when it arises. Now, very briefly on zooming in on the current situation, and also from an EPP perspective, so I move out a bit of the kind of historical approach, and I try to reflect on what are we thinking about the new wave of national conservatism or radical revolutionary conservatism. And my impression is that there have been three phases in the way we have approached it. So we went from a phase of total indifference, in which we could afford, as establishment conservatives, as Christian Democrats, as EPP, which, as you know, comprises both wings, establishment conservatives, Christian Democrats, and even some liberals, some moderate liberals. We could afford to ignore these movements. And this goes, I think, from the 1990s up to the beginning of the financial crisis, let's say 2009. Simply because they were weak, they were marginal, they seemed complete cranks, in most cases, although they were having some successes, if you think about it, and they were interesting, retrospectively thinking, there were interesting developments also in the 1990s. If you look at what became very leading, radical right parties, for example, in England and in France, UKIP, which was one of the parties, Farage party, one of the drivers of Brexit, and the Front National of Jean-Marie Le Pen in France, they first started to raise their head and mobilize in the campaigns against the Maastricht Treaty in the 1990s. And so already something was happening, but these forces were too weak for us to bother with them. And this lasted, I think, until 2009. In 2009, we became aware that we were entering a new phase because there was the general crisis hitting Europe, but also because 2009 is the year in which the joint group in the European Parliament that the EPP had with the British Conservatives breaks down. There used to be a joint group, although many people have forgotten that. And so there is an awareness that something is happening on the right, that a lot of conservative movements are becoming more nationalist, and they are shifting to the right. And so a new phase begins, which I call a phase of total opposition. And that phase goes roughly from 2009 to, I would say, recent years, 2019, 2020, in which the EPP, if you look at voting patterns also at the national level, it tended to retrench with the other pro-EU forces, the socialists, the liberals, the Greens, to do deals with them and to try to build what is called the cordon sanitaire, so the kind of isolating barrier that will keep these movements out as completely incompatible with the existing system, which was threatened, you may remember in this period, by very existential crises, financial crisis, euro crisis, in the middle of the 2010s, the massive migration crisis, and then later the COVID-19 crisis. So that was the kind of reflex, protective reflex. I'm checking the time because I don't want to speak too much. How much longer do I have?
I think maybe 5-7 minutes.
Okay, yeah. And then we come to the third and last phase, which is the phase of recent years, where there has been a change of approach, and we enter the phase of what I would call selective cooperation with these movements. So no longer indifference because they are too strong, no longer total opposition, and I will explain why, but selective cooperation, selective engagement. The first issue is sides. These movements went from irrelevance to gaining about 5% every European elections, if you look at the aggregate level. So at the moment, they have about a third of the European Parliament is made up of parties, so more than 30% of parties that are to the right of the EPP, which are organized in 3 different groups for reasons that I will explain in a moment. So there is a problem of sites. Another problem, which will be a little bit technical, but it's important, is the structure of the European political system, that we moved from a situation in which the EPP and the Socialists were the 2 dominant elements in the European Parliament, and since the EPP was the stronger one, it was the dominant element, because the 2 of them together had an absolute majority of the European Parliament. In 2019, for the first time, because the center was shrinking, the pro-EU center was shrinking, we were the first party, but we were, if we excluded any cooperation with the right, we had to enter essentially coalition talks with forces that were all to our left and that combined together were stronger than the EPP. So the Socialists, the Liberals, and the Greens. So this means that you are the strongest party, but you end up being the junior partner of a progressive coalition, essentially, in the European Parliament. And so this was another concern. The other reason why the thinking of selective cooperation started, I think, creeping in, is that it seemed that these movements were evolving in their approach to Europe, particularly, post-Brexit. They shifted, I mean, before Brexit, most of the movements wanted to leave the euro, leave the eurozone, leave the European Union in many cases. Now, basically no one mentions that anymore. Maybe AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, from time to time speaks about being toys with this, but if you look at other radical right movements, they seem to have accepted the horizon of the existence, at least, of European integration. This does not mean that they are not insidious, because if you look at their programs carefully, you will see that they are now pursuing new ways of undermining the EU from within. For example, the primacy of national law over European law, to give you one example, that would destroy the entire EU as we know it today. But certainly the existential threat that they seem to represent is now lesser. And the other maybe change that shifted things is a kind of the strategic outlook with the Ukraine war, because all of a sudden then it looked at many of these parties. They may have been Eurosceptic, but they were strongly supportive of Ukraine, they were strongly pro-Western, and so some of the divides appeared less sharp. And so for all of these reasons, I think we moved in recent years to a kind of more selective engagement and selective cooperation with them. On the assumption, however, I mean, how did we operationalize this? By differentiating among different parties. So by accepting that not everybody to the right of the EPP is in the same box, not everybody represents the same kind of systemic threats to the EU, to the transatlantic alliance. And if you look at the composition of the European Parliament, you will see quite clearly that the European conservatives and reformists, which are the party immediately to the right of the EPP, the Patriots for Europe, which is the party farther to the right where Orban, for example, is sitting, and then this Europe of Nations, there are 3 parties that have significant policy differences, and therefore 3 kind of red lines have been defined that determine the extent to which we could cooperate with them. And this is really, I mean, the official EPP policy. So the first is support for the EU, so parties that would be pro-European integration, in fact, accepting the EU as a supranational political order. The second is support for Ukraine and the transatlantic alliance and NATO, because as you may know, many of these parties in their foreign policy seem to be rather pro-Russian and pro-Putin. So that was made another red line. And the third red line is the problem of the rule of law, because many of these parties are illiberal in the sense that they try to undermine democratic institutions like checks and balances internally. And so the line in the last couple of years has been, at least rhetorically, but I think in practice also to a large extent, we can cooperate with parties farther to the right who fulfill these 3 requirements. And if you think about it, these 3 requirements are essentially, what do they mean? A reaffirmation in the contemporary context of the traditional conservative idea of limited politics and support for the system. Our existing system is what? Our internal democratic order, our European embeddedness, and our transatlantic security arrangements. So as long as these parties support these 3 fundamental pillars of the existing order, establishment conservatives can accept some form of cooperation with them. And the result of that is that now we have joint government in a number of countries with some various of these parties. I mean, in Italy they are in the lead, as you know. Giorgia Meloni is the president of the European Conservatives and Reformists in the European Parliament. In Czechia, in the Netherlands, in Finland, in Sweden, we are in government together. Even in France, if you look carefully at the current Barnier government, it's a minority government that survives because the Front National, or the Rassemblement National, as it is called now, does not topple it, does not vote against it in Parliament. So there is a form of tacit endorsement, even in France. So yeah, this is the new situation that we are facing. It's a situation that will, of course, it's a dilemma that will never leave us. I mean, as we see now, one of them is in the White House. So the whole problem of transatlantic relations will be affected by this, and we will have to decide to what extent also to engage with the Trumpian universe. But yeah, to conclude, I would say, by the way, maybe the last thing is that we observe increasing also forms of cooperation, formal or informal, in the European Parliament within the EPP and the ECR. That's a development that you can read in their newspapers this day, when the ECR candidate for executive vice president of the Commission was essentially treated by the EPP as an EPP almost commissioner for a number of reasons. So my conclusion, and I finish, my impression is that revolutionary conservatism, for the reasons I have explained, is a kind of recurrent, if not permanent, feature of Western political systems. It may even serve some function in the sense that it gives political representation to these pockets of alienation, frustration, that are not captured by the left and tend to receive a more conservative expression. But cooperation has to be very careful. I mean, it has to be based, first of all, on a very in-depth analysis of what kind of movements are we dealing with. Because, I mean, how radical are these movements? Are they on the way towards a more moderate stance? Are they moving towards the center? This was certainly the case with Fratelli d'Italia, Meloni in Italy. So there is always has to be a very shrewd political and historical judgment to understand what kind of parties are we dealing with. And also, the engagement has to be very selective. You have to play divide and rule with this party, but I don't think that we can continue in a situation. I don't think that a system of total opposition is defensible in context in which these parties are now, in some cases, beyond 30% of the electorate. So I think that this is, maybe the other dimension that is important is mainstream conservatives has to be in charge. In countries where it was clear that they would be in charge, cooperation has been refused. Take Austria, where the Freedom Party came first. One possible option would have been a government with the Freedom Party chancellor and with the ÖVP, so the EPP affiliated party support. That was excluded because in this context they are dominant. They are in a dominant position. Yeah, so this is what I would stop here, and then I'm happy to take questions if there is any.
Thanks a lot, Federico, for this very comprehensive and thought-provoking talk. Do we have any questions? Yes, Davide.
Thank you for this visit version of great and lengthy lecture. It was refreshing to hear that. And my question, I believe, so it will be not deviation of a large scale. It's connected with Eurofederalism. And as you mentioned, some current days challenges, those are asking at least a tad more of federalist spirit in the European Union. How do you see current situation? Is there a common ground for all the center-oriented ideologies to have common idea of Europe as a bit more federalist political body?
That's interesting because my first, this is a topic on which I have written actually quite extensively. That, first of all, the first thought that comes to my mind is that Eurofederalism is not a kind of undistinguished, undifferentiated concept. The truth is that there have been different kind of federalist approaches to European integration historically, which cut across political families, but also, I mean, conservatives have tended historically to reject federalism and to embrace forms of confederalism. Giorgia Meloni insists a lot on this concept of confederalism. But if you look even at the Gaullist vision of Europe, it's essentially a confederalist vision of Europe. They believe in a united Europe, but a Europe that has no supranational element, no federal element. Socialists have had an approach to federalism that is very centralized. It's a very centralized form of federalism. Look at, I don't know, Altiero Spinelli is the, chief theoretician in the 1940s, and then he has gone on to become also an important member of the European Parliament, commissioner. But still now, I think, because they insist a lot on economic equality, they need a Europe that is very intrusive, that can equalize outcome, regulate the economy, and so on and so forth. So they tend to have a very centralized vision of federalism. Christian Democrats, and I come to the tradition that is closest to the EPP, I think they had a very subsidiarity-based, I come again to him because he will speak about this, vision of federalism. So the idea that Europe as a community of autonomous communities that exist, in which the European level exists to allow the lower levels to fully realize their potential of autonomy. This is the concept of, right? I mean, you try to keep things as close as possible to the lowest level. This does not prevent escalating further when it is needed, but there is clearly a preference in favor of the lower level and of a polycentric order in a kind of subsidiary federalist framework. So this is just a clarification of the different traditions of federalism. Now, coming to today's political discussion, I don't think that any of this is particularly relevant, to be honest, because, I mean, we failed the last grand constitutional experiment with the failure of the constitutional treaty in 2005, in France and the Netherlands. So I see no appetite in Brussels for any grand constitutional change that would formally move in a more federalist direction. We are going to operate under the framework of the current treaties and then pragmatically strengthen areas of policies that are deemed in need of strengthening. One obvious one now is defense. So we are doing it for the first time. We have a defense commissioner. We are trying to use the articles of the treaties that will allow creatively to reinforce cooperation and joint delivery on defense. You could see that as a step in the direction of strengthening European integration, the European Union, in a federalist direction, but it's not declared as such, and it's not constitutionally recognized as such. But I think that there is certainly a consensus on a number of issues. I mean, a consensus is a big word. There is a broad understanding with majorities that need to be built issue by issue in the European Parliament on a number of topics like immigration and the control of borders, like stepping up on security and defense, like the competitiveness agenda, which is quite big in the current Commission. I think there is a general understanding that this is the way to go, also because in this cycle, unlike the previous one, the EPP is overwhelmingly dominant. For the first time in this parliament, you have no majority to the left of the EPP. It's the first time since the direct election. So this means that potentially, theoretically, I mean, the EPP, the socialists and the liberals can never outnumber the EPP on anything. And the EPP potentially has even, and it has played with it in recent weeks, an alternative majority to play with, which will never be an organic majority, but it's a means of, it's a leverage to extract negotiating concessions from the pro-EU mainstream. And also the Commission, we were talking about this with some of you, if you look at the composition of the Commission, 15 commissioners out of 27 are EPP, including the President, and 2 are farther to the right, which means that 17 out of 27 commissioners are center-right or farther right. Again, unprecedented. So this means that there is a strength of center-right and right-wing forces that, of course, this can also create tensions. So you need to be very careful to balance things politically, because the liberals and the socialists remain fundamental in European games. But so far, I think the game has worked out quite well, if you look at the results of the hearings. And I am quite confident that it will be an interesting legislature from this point of view.
Yes, okay, thank you. I suggest that maybe we go on with Laurynas' talk, and then if we have time, we can make a joint question and answer session, including Federico as well. So the last talk of today is by Laurynas Peluritis, and his talk is sovereignty and subsidiarity of the nation state in the European Union. So, Laurynas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Simas, thank you, Federico. I will be talking on a more abstract level, and I'll be more polemical in what I want to say, but I would suggest that the question of sovereignty in many cases is at the heart of tensions that riddle the European Union as a political project, not in terms of legal theory or legal practice, but more in terms of it being as an ideological concept. And all Eurosceptic discussions about the evils of European bureaucracy, the dictate of Brussels, taking back control, the slogan of Brexit, were based or are based on a certain understanding or a certain imagination of what it means to be a sovereign state, what it means to be a sovereign country. And I think here we not only have a sort of political conflict, but also the various enemies of the European project or Euro-Atlantic integration more in general try to explore, but a conceptual conflict that needs to be addressed. And I think that this is one of the rare cases when debates on political theory and history of political ideas has, to an extent, an impact on political discourse, on political practice, sometimes. Not always, but I think to some extent is. And I think the main question is, of this ideological debate is about the interpretations of Rousseauian or Rousseauistic and Schmittian concepts of sovereignty, and I chose Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Carl Schmitt because their conceptions are very different, but also share certain core premises, but also because especially of the growing in the last few decades influence of Schmitt on, especially on the far right, and the reception of his ideas by various autocratic regimes. And Rousseau, being the proponent of popular sovereignty, in his treatise on the social contract, he stated that sovereignty is indivisible. You either have it or you don't. To quote him, I'll read the quote, "For the same reason that sovereignty is inalienable, it is indivisible. For the will is either general or it is not. It is either that of the body of the people or that of only part of it. In the first case, this declared will is an act of sovereignty and constitutes law. In the second case, it is only a particular will or an act of magistracy. It is at most a decree." And Carl Schmitt, as many of you know, in his political theology in 1922, he said, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." And he, of course, argued against popular constitutional sovereignty, but similarly to Rousseau, saw any kind of limitations on decision-making as a threat to sovereignty itself. So according to Schmitt, sovereignty, and thus the state itself, resides in determining definitely what constitutes public order and security, in determining when they are disturbed, and so on. For him, any kind of international law or any transnational structures are a threat towards sovereign authority. And I think this perspective is wrong, but not in the sense that I would necessarily disagree with specific descriptions of what sovereign authority or sovereign power is, but rather with its interpretations and application of interpretations. A great example for me personally here when theory comes to practice is Brexit. Many intellectual Brexiteers were sort of positioning their cause that is a struggle for taking back sovereignty. However, was British sovereignty as authority and power to exercise political and legal decision-making in the highest order in a certain jurisdiction, meaning on certain territory and for certain people, ever threatened by EU? And of course, many European Union institutions control certain areas of common policy, but Britain always had the decision of the sovereign, the option of the sovereign decision to leave, which it did. Now it's paying the price, and so the appetite for leaving the EU or threatening leaving the EU is a lot lower because of that. But I think it could be argued even in Rousseauistic or Schmittian terms that Britain, after Brexit, did not become more sovereign. Because it never lost any kind of sovereignty to begin with. And my then addition to it, maybe it could even be argued that Britain became less sovereign because of leaving the EU, and I'll get to it at the part of about subsidiarity. And since joining the European Union, in Lithuania we also had similar debates. They were not so much on the political mainstream, more to the sort of marginal radical left and radical right movements, or certain populist movements, that somehow joining EU and NATO is a threat to Lithuanian sovereignty, or whether sort of Lithuanian identity will persist in a common European political project. Will Lithuanian sovereignty in any kind of sense, or broad cultural autonomy and originality, be eroded by this sort of integration into the European political project? And of course, some voices still, for example, in Orban's Hungary, would argue that the EU as it is now is a threat to the survival of nation states and their sovereignty. But of course, these debates are based on a certain vagueness that they fail, I think, very often in case of Orban, because the guy is clearly not stupid and well educated, fail on purpose to then, well, say what sovereignty is. You know, what part of Hungarian sovereignty exactly is being threatened by the EU, or why then he doesn't leave the EU, even though, you know, he has the option. I think many people in the European Union, I'm not talking about German car companies, would be happy with Hungary leaving for political and value-based reasons. But then exactly this vagueness about when we talk about the concept of sovereignty and what the surrounding concepts is what is driving this sort of discourse as the EU being a threat to sovereignty or national identity and so on. And so even if we agree with what sovereignty means, is having political independence, or sovereignty means the political community has the power to exercise their own decisions. Again, returning to the Rousseauistic sense, very often it's placed that, well, if you have sort of common EU policy, your sovereignty then is somehow limited. But, well, in this case, you would have to look at countries or failed states in some cases that are beyond international law. So southern Sudan, North Korea, in this sort of interpretation of Rousseauian or Schmittian sovereignty, are much more sovereign than Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Italy, and so on. Now, I think sort of presenting these absurd examples shows what's wrong with this sort of radical interpretation of sovereignty versus non-sovereignty. This is very often presented by the alt-right ideologues in in intellectual debates. And of course, one of the key factors, I think, why Lithuanian perspective, and broadly Central Eastern European perspective on sovereignty is different is our historical experience, because nation states here emerge under quite different circumstances than in Western Europe. And many of them had their roots in 19th century romanticist nationalist movements. Also, it had to do with the collapse of the Russian Empire, the collapse of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on, which happened after World War I. But not only. So it's not only that World War I is the main event here. And of course, when we look at the interwar period in Central and Eastern Europe, many countries were not successful democracies. There were various political and economic issues in establishing a nation state that is fundamentally, economically insufficient within itself. It lacks the sort of what Aristotle argues in his Politics, why people establish a polis, a city-state, is in order to achieve self-sufficiency, at least, first of all, in the economic sense, but also more broadly, we can say, socially and morally. But so, of course, Nazi Germany and Soviet Union and later on Soviet occupation changed all that, and also I think it kind of entrenched the very different experience that Central and Eastern European countries have of what it means to be in the common European project, because if you would look from a historical perspective, when was Lithuania more sovereign? Was it in the interwar years where it was basically politically isolated? We had the conflict with Poland for Vilnius. The only truly friendly state we had a border with was Latvia, and north of that was Estonia and Finland. So we didn't have that many friendly neighbors. We had always a very tense relationship with Germany, even prior to Nazis taking power there. Soviet Union was always a looming threat on the horizon. We had a tense relationship and so on. Now, Lithuanian perspective is that we are participating in common European policy, where given the seat with the great European powers, or sometimes we have the ability to sort of steer to some extent what, for example, France or Germany are discussing in Washington or Beijing and so on. So this historical experience, I think, presents that from our perspective, this EU being a threat towards sovereignty is based on theoretical false dichotomies which do not hold up neither in practice, but they do not hold up in theory as well. And going towards, I will not discuss all the questions on European federalization and so on, but I think going to the concept of the Christian Democrat concept of subsidiarity, we can have a very good answer how sovereignty could function, and I think currently now more or less functions in that way from a standpoint of political philosophy. What subsidiarity is about, if we look at the papal encyclicas of Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Anno, is that if something can be achieved or done by the industries and the powers of the individual person, it should be left for them. Or if something can be achieved in the framework of a family or small community, it should be left to them. And moving on, and then if only these smaller entities cannot solve some kind of issue or some kind of problem, then there is a need for state intervention. But now the problem is, especially for small and medium-sized countries, of course, we have global threats. emerging, but not only, of course, we talked about war, we talk about climate change, but also in a globalized economy, or you can, some would argue even post-globalized economy, where there is a need to reinforce global trade, to protect access to markets and so on. For smaller countries to remain sovereign, cooperation is necessary because they're facing challenges that are beyond their powers, that are beyond their capabilities. And I think what EU can offer through the framework of subsidiarity is exactly reinforcement and strengthening of sovereignty in face of global challenges that cannot be met only with the forces of a separate nation state. So, and I think many of these issues are direct challenges for particular nation states for their sovereignty, but they do not have the capacities to find the responses on their own. And so looking for a more broad theoretical framework, I would say that the sort of EU model more or less that we are trying to steer now, especially on the right, is towards cooperation through subsidiarity, but it is not a threat, nor theoretically, nor practically, to the sovereignty of the nation state. So thank you so much for your attention. I will conclude my talk so we can begin the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Do you have any questions to Laurynas? Okay, so while you're thinking, just a quick one. I mean, it seems that, and already Mantas Adomėnas has also raised this question that for us in Lithuania, which is kind of a small state and always having this very dangerous neighbor, very threatening all the time. For us, like this more dispersed kind of decision-making or sovereignty is a necessity. Like we cannot do otherwise. It's a geopolitical necessity. And you know, Schmitt and Rousseau, they are representatives of big European, Western European countries. So for them, it's kind of maybe understandable to formulate these conceptions of sovereignty that they had in their text. So is this difference related only to the size of the state and the geopolitical position, or do you think there is also some more deeper philosophical or theoretical edge in this case?
Well, I think it is more deeply in terms of how what we understand as being sovereign means, because if you have a very rigid interpretation of sort of Rousseauistic or Schmittian concepts in practice, then no state on earth, even such states as the United States of America, couldn't be considered sovereign because it has international treaties, it is well established within the global economy and is well connected through networks of global trade, and it depends very much on these things. So even countries like the United States are not sovereign. And even if you go to even countries then like Germany or France, which are by no means small countries, they are not sovereign by this criteria either. I think the problem is that and it's not a legal issue for lawyers who work with EU law and versus national law and help writing all those documents every day in Brussels and Vilnius and other capitals. It's not a theoretical issue in terms of legal practice. It is an issue of, I think, ideological imaginations. That the concept that sort of outright intellectuals that they're proposing as the ideal of sovereign existence is unattainable well, first, it's unattainable in practice, but it's also what I tried to show at the beginning of my talk. It's based on an intellectual misunderstanding. Yeah, Nadia.
Thank you. The globalization changed everything, yes. And then we speak, that means that Rousseau and Schmitt, they didn't even have this reality before they rise, because we have this transnational economic flows and so on, mega corporations, and that are also perhaps the most threats also to the sovereignty of the states. So my question is, perhaps you have this new formula. What would be the formula of sovereignty in this new situation of this global world? Because you said that perhaps no, except North Korea and some other similar countries, the other countries, they don't have this sovereignty in this classical sense. So what is the formula? How could we explain for our population that without any difficult conceptions and speculations that we are more sovereign than, for example, interwar Lithuania?
Well, I think that part of the mix-up is that we sometimes think of sovereignty and autonomy or autarky as interchangeable concepts, and I think it's wrong. Sovereignty does not mean that you're completely autonomous from the outside world, and I think that's the sort of presupposition on which the alt-right concept of sovereignty is based. But I don't think there is that big of an issue of suggesting what sovereignty is. I don't think the Lithuanian state has lost supreme authority and jurisdiction within its borders concerning its citizens. And it can always exercise, if it wants to, these powers. It's always the option. The problem would become loss of sovereignty is the removal of options to take certain decisions. And I don't see how certain options are removed. Okay, we're part of NATO, going to war is maybe a little bit problematic. Yeah, fiscal matters. But I mean, it is not, we can, at any point, we can exit the Eurozone, reestablish our own currency to our own detriment. We have this decision as an option available. Will it benefit us? Probably no. But we have this option. It's, you know, it's never ceased to exist. I mean, that's why I think Brexit is such a great example. It was sort of based on the myth, well, now we will achieve sovereignty as certain autonomy, and they found out, well, a lot of things that were sort of on the automatic done by Brussels, now your local bureaucracy has to do it. And a lot of sort of mundane policy questions that were carried out by bureaucrats sort of become a national agenda thing to the detriment of the British people. And I think that in the sense, there's always the option for the sovereign decisions to be made, but they will always have a price, just as previously any kind of sovereign decision had a price. I don't think that Hannah Arendt, when she was writing on revolution, I think in or either the foreword or in the introduction, she was warning, well, American political discourse and discourse of political philosophy sort of starting to write more and more about the European concept of sovereignty. And Arendt says, well, this is dangerously stupid because it's... If it's misunderstood what it means to be sovereign, it can cause all sorts of political ideological problems, I think.
Right, and by the way, North Korea is heavily dependent on China, so even in this case...
Well, economically dependent, but, you know...
Politically as well, I imagine. Federico?
Yeah, indeed, very thought-provoking and interesting presentation. Thanks for that. A couple of thoughts. I mean, thought-provoking, therefore it provoked some thoughts. The first on Schmidt. You are quoting Political Theology, which is an early book of Schmidt, 1923. But of course, Schmidt shifted across his life on the concept of sovereignty. Writing in the late 30s and then during the war, he already was moving beyond the traditional conception of sovereignty towards an idea of imperial spaces dominated by an hegemonic power that would exclude external influences. And this was consolidated in his post-war writing, The Nomes of the Earth, notably. So the late Schmidt did not share the concept of sovereignty that you pointed out. He was much more along the line of Europe as an imperial space from which American influence and Russian influence should be excluded. And of course, this begs the question, who is the hegemon? And of course, for Schmidt, it was obvious, it was Germany, the hegemon. Second thought that your presentation provoked on the concept of sovereignty as such, my impression is I have always found sovereignty a frustratingly outdated and unhelpful concept in the European discussion. We all know how it arose. I mean, it had a purpose when Baudin was writing about it in the 16th century because it was a means of pacifying the European monarchies after the religious wars. I think by the time Rousseau was writing about it, it had already lost its relevance because from a concept of pacification, it became a concept of mutual slaughtering and warmongering on the European continent. And I personally find that subsidiarity and sovereignty are two incompatible concepts because a subsidiarity-based order is a collection of autonomies. Nobody is sovereign. I mean, the essence of a subsidiary order is that it dissolves the concept of sovereignty because sovereignty is the highest authority, superiorem non recognoscens, according to the Latin, right? Not recognizing any superior power. And of course, that's the denial of subsidiarity because subsidiarity is an organic order of autonomous communities structured from the bottom up in which nobody is the ultimate sovereign. So I think a subsidiarity-based order must accept as its theoretical and probably even constitutional horizon the dissolution of sovereignty, and I think this should be the ethos of the EU much more than I hear a lot of talk about European sovereignty these days, which I understand the logic. I mean, since these guys are shouting that the EU is a threat to sovereignty, we make your argument, which is a valid argument substantially, right? We shift sovereignty. We can only be sovereign at the European level. This is the Macron-inspired rhetoric. But when you discuss it at the level of political theory, I think it's a very fuzzy notion. I don't think it's very defensible theoretically. And the last point maybe, I think my feeling is that you may be underestimating a little bit. I mean, you have sovereignty of last resort in the EU, okay? I mean, and even the examples that you quote, you can leave the Eurozone, but you are activating, or you can leave the EU as Britain did, but you are activating Article 50 and you are reclaiming your sovereignty of last resort. While you are in the EU, you are sharing sovereignty. So you accept that you are sharing sovereignty, you are not full control. You have a say in the process through the European Parliament and your representatives there, through your representatives in the Council. But if it is true that 70% of our regulations come from Brussels, well, it is true that these regulations, the Lithuanian Parliament has no full control over them anymore. So in my opinion, the loss of sovereignty is not, I mean, it's more real than you make it, and also the protection of subsidiarity could be strengthened, honestly, at the EU level. Because at the moment, it's not justiciable. The concept of subsidiarity, if you try to bring, people have tried, to bring a European regulation that you deem in violation of subsidiarity in front of the European Court of Justice on this ground, the European Court of Justice will tell you, oh, but this is a political principle, I cannot adjudicate it, so it's the Commission who decides. But the Commission, of course, has an interest in centralization, because centralization means more power for the Commission, so the Commission will always say, yes, this respects the principle of subsidiarity. So I am a European federalist, but I am a federalist of the Christian democratic variety. So I think we need a federalism that is Hannah Arendt, pluralist, against the concept of sovereignty, and that reinforces the protection of subsidiarity at the European level.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions?
So, my question, I suppose, pertains more to Federico's first part of the talk. you mentioned that one of the defining characteristics of left is the perception that both culture and nature is malleable and can be influenced through actionable deeds, right? And later on, you mentioned to an extent that the desire for change on the right side, especially on the disenfranchised right side, sometimes finds an outlet through these pseudo-revolutionary acts like marches upon capital and things like that. However, could it not be argued that an outlet for the proper, the majority right is sort of free market capitalism perspective? That the desire for change is satisfied through, basically free market evolution.
My ideological instinct is to answer yes, because I am rather free market myself. And I am one of the Italian translators of Hayek, out of all people. So I have translated for the first time in Italian Hayek's essays on European integration. They have never been translated. And I have in the past even defended a Hayekian federalism, can you imagine, for the European Union, which is a kind of more liberal variant of the Christian democratic ideas that we are talking about. So I agree with you in principle. Ideologically, I think it is a theoretically and desirable concept. But the fact of the matter, I'm afraid, is that whether we like it or not, part of the rebellion that we are seeing from the right is a rebellion against free market ideas. I have the feeling, which make everybody better off in the long run, but in the short run they seem to have generated that sense of disenfranchisement, a sense of pauperization. I think in some parts of the European middle class they have caused, objectively, I think, a situation of economic suffering. So that is a bit the difficult balance that we need to navigate between what we know to be theoretically correct in the long run, but the Keynesian also intimation that in the long run we are all dead and people vote not in the long run but in the very short run. And if the center right does not take that into account, I mean, we risk losing ground. So I'm not sure it's a very intellectually sophisticated answer. The question would deserve a better one. But yeah, this is the tension that I see between what we know to be correct and what we are bound to do, we are dragged to do now politically.
If we don't have any more questions from the audience, yes, two questions for Federico, and both are more historical than sort of a clarifications on your lecture, on your address, than philosophical. I was very intrigued by the what you've described as the interwar Germany, Weimar's Germany, revolutionary conservatism, and I wanted to just clarify what kind of breed they were. I mean, were they some sort of the early national socialist thinkers? Were they some sort of the driven by nostalgia to the Kaiserreich, to the Kaiserreich Germany, or just in a nutshell, people who follow that, you know, Dolchstoß myth, or what kind of breed they were. And on the very sort of a marginal note, could Carl Schmitt be included in some sort of a camp of revolutionary conservatism, either early Schmitt, as Laurynas referred to his concept of sovereignty, or latter Schmitt? And my second question, which is, so first one about interwar Germany, and my second point is a question about the I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure that you would have to say something about that. But the question is very simple. What was the impact, in your view, of the Second Vatican Council on the development of the Christian and conservative thought in the continental Europe? were there some kind of a serious reconsideration of itself, political itself, after the Second Council of the Vatican? It's just, I feel this question is rather relevant in where we are in Lithuania, where this traditional Catholic country, which undergoes this debates on the role of church in the wider society, on the role of priests and etc. Thank you very much, Federico.
Yeah, very relevant questions. Maybe I will start from the second one. Of course, it's a complex question. We could have an entire lecture or monographic course on this, but I think that my impression is that, and I would not necessarily be the one giving it because I'm not sure I'm qualified, but my impression is that the Vatican II Council is more a product of intellectual changes that happened before than it's more a point of arrival, and it is the starting point of another conversation which has never quite died out in the Catholic Church and which is still ongoing, and some of whose features are now coming back with a vengeance under Pope Francis and are destabilizing the Church. But the Vatican II Council as such is the product of intellectual transitions that happened in the interwar period and in the early post-war period. Of course, the emblematic man for this is Jacques Maritain, right? Many of whose writings were in the interwar period. He started as a very classic political Catholic, reactionary, the reactionary school, and then he slowly evolved, and by the early post-war period he had embraced modern democratic. It's the transition that I have traced at the beginning, from political Catholicism to Christian democracy. So from head-on confrontation with modernity to believing that you can infiltrate modernity and change the trajectory of modernity in a direction that is no longer anti-Christian, or no longer secularist. And so I think the Vatican II Council was the product of that transition within the Church, of that optimism, and it was also a compromise solution on many issues, because as you know, on some issues there were sharp divisions, and part of the Church has never accepted it. The Lefebvre secession, which was not intended as a secession. Lefebvre believed that the Church, the Council had destroyed the Church and betrayed the Church, as it should be. And so these questions, the two, of course, the two popes, let's say, preceding the current one, have tended to give a rather traditionalist or interpretation of the Vatican II results, in my opinion, wisely in many ways, because they feared the rupture. First of all, one came from Poland and was primarily an anti-communist. The other came from Bavaria and was essentially a supranational conservative, very different from an Argentinian pope, whose political enemies growing up were completely different. Now we face a lot of these questions tend to be interpreted in a much more progressive direction, and this is creating frictions in the Catholic Church. I don't know how many of you are acquainted now with Vatican things and go to the Vatican. It's the atmosphere in the Vatican is frankly, I don't know how to say it politely. Nobody trusts anybody, and the Church is paralyzed, and there might be a conclave soon, and nobody knows what will be the result and which direction the Church would take. So, but yeah, to end now, I am going beyond your question. I think Vatican II was the end point of a transition, and it was opened up a number of questions that John Paul II and Pope Ratzinger kept under control, and that exploded under Pope Francis, and we don't know what will be the solution of them. As to your first question, what kind of breed were... First of all, I think Carl Schmitt, yes, I would consider him, I think that's the breed. You see why I'm saying these are not fascists. They are not Nazis. Carl Schmitt was the crown jurist of the Third Reich, but he was not a Nazi, strictly speaking. He started as a Catholic reactionary, and then he slowly moved, towards embracing, which Catholic reaction is a very static political concept. It's a very institutionally static, authoritarian political concept. The revolutionary conservative concept is a very dynamic one. So it embraces change. It has a kind of apocalyptic sense that everything has to change. It is backward looking in its historical imagination, as I said, very futuristic very often in its technological prowess. I think all these guys were prior to the Nazis. And also I would not overemphasize, I mean, they reached their apex of their influence under Weimar, but already before the First World War, there were the youth movements that I have mentioned in Germany started in the last decades of the 19th century already as a rebellion, a kind of spiritualist rebellion against the bourgeois positivism and the cultural crisis of the Belle Époque. Of course, also Nietzsche's nihilism also plays a role in these people. An German-American Jewish historian has written an excellent book on some of these authors, The Politics of Cultural Despair. You might know the book. Cultural despair is a very, and I find it in a lot of the contemporary revolutionary conservatives, right? They believe that this kind of Spenglerian sense that this is Spengler was, by the way, another one of them. That this is an inevitable process of decay, and that there is no, I mean, the Catholic conservative has at least a kind of eschatological hope about him. Hope is an important political category for him, although it is not a hope to be attained in history necessarily. But beyond history, there is hope. There is hope for salvation. The revolutionary conservative very often is drowned in this nihilistic sense that everything is falling apart and that something violent and radical has to be done to reclaim. But he's not a Nazi. He does not want to build a new man. He has nostalgia for the lost values of the past. He does not want to build a new religion, a new man like the Nazi wants, you know. He does not believe in attaining perfection also in this world, I think, yeah. Anyway, it's a long conversation that we could have about it.
Yeah, okay, so thanks once again to Federico and Laurynas. And Theodoros.
Yes, so a couple of words. Thank you very much for this busy second part of the day. Thank you all for coming. Of course, first of all, thanks, huge appreciation to our speakers who've dedicated their time and their intellectual effort to share these ideas and insights with us. So huge thanks. Thanks, of course, to Wilfried Martens Center for supporting us. We are being filmed, so we have to say that. And of course, thank you, Federico, for coming. We do hope that we will continue with these kind of events. It was titled a conference, but I think it was more of a seminar, more of a cozy type. So I think it went all right. I do apologize for some technical mishaps that occurred. These things happen. So please be please be tolerable towards that. And the final point, the two final points. I firstly invite you, all of you, to follow us on Facebook. First of all, we are posting all our news and events and all the updates on Facebook. So please do follow us. And the latter point, you are very welcome, all of you, this evening in half an hour to our office, to Carmelito Street 3, where we are going to have some wine and chachapuris. And so you are very welcome to continue this evening with us. And yes, let's be acquainted and let's keep together. So thank you for your time. Thank you.